This is TWiT.
Now, let's get brown. It's not easy being brown.
It's not even, well, it's a little easier, actually. I'm going back to Canada. One of the reasons is that this weekend is celebration weekend up here on the coast for me and many of my friends. My birthday, my wife's birthday, a ton of friends' birthdays, all fall in this week-long period. Thank you.
Nice.
And so they all come up. We used to do this at my house down in the city, but now we're going to do it up on the coast, which people are really excited about. So there's a lot of whiskey coming. And one of the bottles coming is this particular edition, the Crown Royal Blender's Mash. And it made me think about going back to the Canadian whiskey stories. So I went back and listened to when I first mentioned Crown Royal back in like 814. When I was not even I was just guesting. And so we sort of threw that in there. And then we did that 20-minute or so bit on Canadian whiskey where I talked about the Prohibition games and all that sort of stuff. But I never really drilled into the origins of this particular whiskey and this whiskey maker, which is Seagram's. Because and as I drilled into it, it's like, I should talk a little bit about Seagram's because this has been around a long time. And then when I actually got into the story, it's like, I am reading the script from Succession here. It got kind of nuts. The Seagram's company is a crazy story. And not because of the guy named Seagram's.
Because of Bronfman or?
Bronfman, yeah. It's absolutely the nutty story. So if you go all the way back to the beginning, 1857, so that's pre-Confederation. Canada is not yet Canada yet. A group of folks, none of them named Seagram's, this is Hespeler and Randall, create the Granite Mills and Waterloo Distillery. So they're bringing grain into Waterloo, which is on the lake, and making flour from it. And then any leftover grain that they haven't got sales for flour, they're going to make into whiskey as sort of the side venture. And this was the town of Waterloo in what was then known as Upper Canada, because it's not Ontario yet. Canada's not a country yet. And they start making a rye whiskey. They were German immigrants, and so their rye whiskey was called Altkunschnaps, for old rye, because they were mostly processing wheat, but wheat whiskey by itself doesn't taste particularly good. But if you add a little rye to it, it's get a little spicy. It's tasty. It's all good. So that's 1857. By 1864, they hire a fellow by the name of Joseph Seagram, who is taking care of one of the partners' interests. At this point, they've scaled up to making about 50,000 gallons of spirits a year. Of course, all still sold in barrels at that time. And within a decade or so, by 1883, Seagram has brought out all of the partners and owns it entirely himself and renames the company Joseph Seagram Flour Mill and Distillery Company. A few years later, he'll make his first named version of whiskey for Seagram's called the Seagram's 83, based on the fact that he bought it in 1883. And by 1911, during World War I, he's brought his sons into the company, renames the company Joseph Seagram's and Sons. And that's about as far as it goes on the Seagram side, because now comes the Bronfmans, right? And Samuel Bronfman, this guy's got a biography for a reason. He's like a force of nature. Born in 1889 on a ship traveling from what was then known as Bessarabia, now we know it as Moldova, to Canada. And they ends up his family lands in Manitoba, and they get in the hoteling business. But in the 1920s, as Prohibition has taken hold in the U.S., they realize the opportunities for distilling are huge. So they set up a distillery in LaSalle, Quebec. And then they call the company the Distillers Corporation Limited, which I think was a play, because this is a time when Distillers Company Limited out of the UK was the largest entity in Scottish whiskey. And in fact, by 1927, at the height of sort of the stock craze, they make a deal with the Distillers Company to sell half of their business. They get away from the name conflict, but they also get access to all the distribution rights for the popular Scottish blends at the time. So that's Haig, Black and White, Dewar's, VAT 69, all big. The next year, Seagram's goes public, and DCL, Distillers Corp, basically buys them out. Essentially does a forced merge by buying enough stock quickly enough on leverage to end up essentially forcing a merger. And this becomes a theme with the Seagram's leadership with the Bronfman family, that they do a lot of forced takeovers and hostile takeovers of various companies. So the new entity in 1928 is called Distillers Corporation Seagrams, and basically the Seagrams family is a minority shareholder, and off they go. This is when this, of course, during U.S. Prohibition, and the Canadians are allowed to make whiskey. They just can't sell it directly to the U.S. And I think I told you this story back in the Canadian story where they use the islands of St. Pierre and Milton off the coast of Newfoundland because they're actually French protectorates, and the French couldn't care less about Prohibition. And so they would ship all of their whiskey to St. Pierre, this tiny little island that used to just be a cod fishery, now was covered in warehouses storing various kinds of booze, and then would sell it as a French entity into the U.S. And when the U.S. gets upset about that, then they start putting them on ships and going just offshore so that they're outside of the country borders. And then the American citizens go out to the ship, have a party, and come home with cases of booze, like all workarounds, one after the next. The Bronfmans went maybe a step too far because they started using Milton to sell whiskey back into Canada to avoid the taxes. And so as Prohibition ends, they actually end up in investigated by the RCMP, but managed to make a settlement so that the case gets dropped. Now, tying this back to our whiskey in question, in 1939, now named Seagrams, they get rid of the DCL name entirely, decides to make a special whiskey in honor of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, which we generally know as the Queen Mother, and mother to Queen Elizabeth II, RIP, on the very first UK royal family tour of Canada in 1939. So George and Elizabeth came by ship up the St. Lawrence and landed near Ottawa, and then took the train, which was part of Confederation. Right? The reason that Canada is because they put a train line all the way across, all the way to Vancouver. In fact, there's a road in Vancouver called the King's Way because it was built for George VI to be able to go from Port Moody, where the train line ended, over to Vancouver proper. And it's the one road that does not connect with the grid system that is the rest of the city. It sort of bisects it. And I've seen old photographs of literally was a dirt track through the forest to connect the two parts, these different pieces of Vancouver together. So, and they make this version of whiskey. They put it in the purple pouch because it's royal colors with gold stitching on it. And you can still buy, Crown Royal in the purple pouch. Good for your D&D dice, yes. And apparently the royal family goes home with cases of it. And for 20 years, it's only sold in Canada before it's finally opened up to a foreign market, specifically the U.S. So Seagrams is a hit. They're doing very well, and they start buying up other distilleries and wineries. They buy some, they start importing rum from Puerto Rico and Jamaica. They end up owning distilleries that make Captain Morgan and Myers and Trelaway's. They even buy Chivas in the UK. Because this is all Sam Bronfman and his aggressively growing the business. And when that slows down, and they kind of are one of the largest booze makers in the world, they branch into petrochemicals. So initially it was Canadian. They brought Royalite in Alberta, but then they bought Texas Pacific Coal and Oil and the Frankfurt Oil Companies. At this time, they build a skyscraper. At the time, the most expensive skyscraper in the world in 1958 in New York for their New York petrochemical operations called the Seagrams Building, which is generally still known as, even though they don't own it anymore. And so by 65, Seagrams is operating in 119 countries with in excess of $1 billion of annual revenue. They are a monster at that time. In 71, Sam Bronfman dies, and the sons and uncles start fighting. The company is controlled by the Bronfman family. The shares have been distributed. Even though it's a publicly traded company, they have the majority voting shares. They call it the Seagrams Company, and they sell off the Texas Pacific operation to Sun Oil Co. for $2.3 million in an effort to buy Conoco, one of the largest oil companies in the world.
From booze to oil. Okay.
Yes, they're still making booze, but they're doing this. And again, they do this as a very hostile takeover approach. And so the board brings DuPont in to buy them instead of allowing Seagrams to do it. And DuPont pulls it off, buys for $7.8 billion. But in the process, because Seagrams had bought up a big chunk of the shares of Conoco, they end up owning 25% of DuPont in the end. They're actually the single largest shareholder of DuPont at that time. And DuPont, because it's also a family-owned company primarily, pays massive dividends every year to shareholders, to the point where within a few years, 70% of the income of Seagrams is DuPont dividends. So they have a lot of cash. Their businesses are almost secondary to the point, and the family gets even crazier. And so the 1990s, they decided to get into entertainment. Now they've been pushed to sell DuPont for a while, so they sell their stake for $8.5 billion. Attempt to buy what then time was known as MCA, now we know as the Universal Music Group. So they end up owning the movies, the movie business, the music business, the theme parks, all of that. And don't know how to make money on it. It is like Succession. And in 2000, because they're mismanaging all these different businesses, the family's all fighting, they get bought by Vivendi, the luxury brands holders, for $42 billion. But in the process, the Bronfman family collectively only owns about 25% of the company. Actually, 25% of Seagrams, they end up owning only 8% of Vivendi. So they have no say. They're on the board, but they have no control. And as the fights go on, Vivendi spins off all the liquor businesses. So Chivas goes to Pernod Ricard, and Crown Royal and all of those other products end up in Diageo.
Oh,
so that's the end of the Bronfmans in booze, but that's sort of the pattern of this entire thing. And it's just a nutty story about Seagrams. Basically is just a brand now. It's not a it's not a company per se.
But
it's
Crown Royal, Blender's Mash, still an excellent.
We need to go back to how does Canadian whiskey different from other kinds of whiskey? The rules of Canadian whiskey are a little looser. The big one, of course, is that they must be mash distilled and aged in Canada. It can only be made with cereal grains, and it has to be aged in wood no less than 3 years, and must be at least 40% alcohol to be called Canadian whiskey. Oh, they also have the phrase, and I just went back and double check this on the Canadian government site. Must, quote, possess the aroma, taste, and character generally attributed to Canadian whiskey.
Whatever that is.
I don't know what that is, but okay.
That's hysterical.
And now let's get into the favorite rule of them all, the 1/11th rule, or what's now known as the 909 or 9.09% rule, which is to say that Canadian whiskey can still be called Canadian whiskey with up to 9.09% of other things in it. Now, that could be coloring, it could be flavoring, or it could be another spirit. Although if it's a spirit, that spirit has to have been aged for at least 2 years. Which pretty much means it has to be some kind of barrel-aged spirit, but it can be any kind of barrel-aged spirit. It can be wine, it can be brandy, it can be whiskey, sherry, port, like some kinds of tequila and rum are aged in wood. Like all of those would qualify under the 909 rule. Now, why does this rule exist? This rule is insane. Like, who would invent this rule? And it turns out it's because of America. So as American whiskey was struggling in the 70s, like most whiskey manufacturers were, they went protectionist and added large tariffs onto imported whiskeys. But there were a lot of influential Americans, including some in the Senate, that loved their Canadian whiskey and didn't want to pay more for it. And so they said, hey, if at least 1/11th of that drink is American whiskey, then it doesn't get taxed at the same rate.
Oh, wow.
And so the Canadians clued in and went, okay, we'll make a rule, the 1/11th rule. It's still Canadian whiskey as long as it's 1/11th. So it wasn't only restricted to export, but it was done so they could export to America at a lower tariffing rate. In the end, it's all about taxes.
Yeah, right? Wow.
But there's a side effect, as insane as it sounds, because there's still restrictions around it, it does open the door to things like they didn't have to struggle to buy sherry barrels to do sherry finishing when they could just add a little bit of sherry to the whiskey. And in fact, things like Alberta Premium Dark Horse has it's mostly Canadian whiskey, 92% of it, and then 8% of it is old granddad bourbon with a little less than 1% sherry in it. There's a whiskey you cannot find anymore called J.P. Weiser's Union 52. because it's 96% 15-year-old Canadian whiskey and 4% 52-year-old Scottish whiskey. It's weird, right? Like, Canadians approach whiskey from a different perspective. One of the most important things to know, and it directly affects Crown Royal and all of the variations, is that the normal approach, because they're not restricted the same way in their barrelings, is that you make separate grain whiskeys and combine them after the fact. So you'll malt and mash and distill wheat separately from rye, separately from barley, and put them all in barrels separately as well. And then combine them at the end to make particular versions of whiskey, to the point where Crown Royal, the original Crown Royal, was 50 different whiskeys combined in different ratios. Now, I can't think of 50 different ways to make whiskey, and I don't know they can either, but there's two core concepts here. This is the idea of base whiskeys and flavoring whiskeys. So a base whiskey is something you distill to a high level, like up into the 60s and 70% range, probably higher than that because you use a column still. Then you cut it with water and put it in used barrels, right? So typically distilled with a column still because it's fast and efficient. Then you level it off to, say, 63.5, the magic number, put it in ex-bourbon casks or put it in sherry casks, things like that. The flavoring whiskeys, they come in much lower, in the 50s, and then put them into raw barrels or other more temperamental barrels where you don't want to pull too much flavor from the wood, just a little. And so you age them for less time and at a lower strength. So you're able to tune all these different additions, different grains, at different concentrations in different kinds of barrels, and then assemble them into the whiskey you want to make. And so, like I said, original Crown Royal, 5 different kinds of grain, 50 different whiskeys, all told with different barrelings to get to that particular edition, which speaks to this fact that all Canadian whiskey is blended. It's just that our thought, when you hear the word blended, you think mostly neutral spirit, but that's against Canadian whiskey rules. You can't call it Canadian whiskey you put neutral spirit in. You have to have aged it. So blended whiskeys from Canada don't have any neutral spirit in them. But virtually everything is blended because you're always combining multiple barrels from multiple sources and multiple grains. So now we get back to Diageo. What is Blender's Mash? Well, Blender's Mash is actually a subset of the whiskeys that make the regular Crown Royal, focused particularly on bourbon. In fact, the original version of it made was called Bourbon Mash. And they even got permission to sell it in the US called Crown Royal Bourbon Mash, except that it made a lot of people angry because it's not bourbon. And so they renamed it to Blender's Mash. Now, it's got a 3-grain mash bill, but understand that these were each different barrels. So 64% corn, 32% rye. I'd consider that very high rye. 4% barley. That's typical. But understand they didn't actually combine those grains together and then make an addition. They literally used more corn barrels than rye barrels, than barley barrels to make the combination. Drink-wise, the way it's described, and I'll have to taste it. I haven't had a chance to taste the bottle because they're fairly rare now. They say it tastes a little like bourbon and a little like Canadian whiskey. So it's a little burny. It's got lots of heat. It's spicy because it's got a strong rye flavor, but it's also very sweet because it's very corn heavy. And it is inexpensive if you can find some. I found that Total Wine had a few bottles at $27. So a bargain, actually, for an interesting Canadian whiskey. And Diageo is now going down to an array of different combinations based on the barrels that they already lay up for making Crown Royal.
Does it still come in a velvet pouch? That's all I care about.
Yeah, that's all that really matters.
There are different editions that come in different kinds of pouches. They've got a new one called Golden Apple, which is supposed to be 26-year-old Canadian whiskey that's got an apple flavor to it.
Ooh.
But it's got a green bag that comes. It's also $250, so don't.
No.
Come on.
No. It doesn't taste like apples. No.
Well, and the maple one is a little horrific. but some people like it. The peach one is
I think
apparently
those
a
would be good
hit.
for cocktails.
Yeah, they're all for cocktails, really. But that's where the golden apple makes no sense. $250 bottle of whiskey I'm going to put into cocktails. That's crazy.
No.
Yeah, right. Nope.
But this just digs further into what's distinctive about Canadian whiskey, and that Diageo's doing right by the brand. They are kind of sticking to. They're not using the 909 rule as much, not certainly for just the export stuff, but they make their own edition of whiskeys, and they're exploring making more editions around their whiskey technique, which is cool. It's distinct to Canada.
Well, there you have it. Of another fine whiskey for you to sample. This show is turning a lot of people into drunks, Richard. I think you should be very proud.
Yep. It's the right way to
I think you can see over my shoulder that I have my. That's the Elburn that's sitting there. Oh, this side. Yeah.
Is that in a decanter? Do you have that in a decanter?
I put it in my decanter. Yes.
And why is that? Just because you want to have it quickly and easily available, or is there some?
Yeah, and I think it looks better.
Yeah, it's pretty.
It's good.
Although I like to see the labels. I mean, the whiskey bottles, they put like wine. They put a lot of effort into them.
They're beautifully developed, right?
Yeah.
So, but I have a nice decanter set, and I'm doing my Mad Men thing.
I think that's nice. Yeah.
My set sits in my office, readily available.
I was so tempted to buy a martini set like as seen on Mad Men. I love that idea.
Yep. It's legit.
Yeah. Is that beautiful crystal? I bet it is.
That is Bohemian Crystal, a genuine article.
I bet it is. He's got class, Paul. I don't know what he's doing on this show with us, but
I got it in Bohemia when it was just they call it a decanter.
They call it it's a decanter. Yeah, it's all it is.
decanter.
Yeah.